Welcome to Wisdom of the Bible channel. Few Bible passages are as short yet as unsettling as those mentioning the nephilim, giants and massive beings who, according to ancient traditions, lived among humans and influenced civilization before the flood. Most people read these verses, move forward, and forget about them. But those who examine them carefully, those who dare to ask the right questions, discover something far deeper than what typical Sunday sermons reveal. And one of these rarely posed questions is also one of the most troubling. If giants existed, did female giants also exist? Where is the proof of these so-called giantesses? Why don't we hear about them in official records or even in the boldest theories of mainstream archaeology? In this episode, you will explore forgotten paths, forbidden texts, and overlooked evidence to learn whether these enormous women truly existed, and if they did, they could completely transform our understanding of these entities' role in early human civilization before the flood. This remains one of the most discussed and speculated topics in biblical and historical conversations, involving many curious people and scholars. The ancient Nephilim figure creates as much fascination as confusion, and many seek to better understand the context where these mysterious beings appeared. What we know is that according to biblical records, the Nephilim were a race of giants who came from unions between the sons of God or fallen angels called the Watchers and human women. This story is clearly mentioned in Genesis 6 and in passages from the book of Jude that refer to these beings. This specific point creates a huge range of questions, and among them comes a debate that has generated tremendous interest in recent decades. Did giantesses exist, the female counterparts of these giants? Were there giant women in ancient times alongside enormous male beings? This question becomes even more important because in most cases, both in the Bible and in other non-canonical texts, the giant figure is almost always male. And when ancient people's mythology addresses beings of such extraordinary height in many cultures, the focus almost exclusively falls on male giants with little or no mention of female figures who shared these traits. In this way, the mystery and doubt about giant women or giantesses continues today, becoming one of the greatest puzzles that fascinates both biblical scholars and lovers of ancient mythologies. This silence about giantesses in scriptures and mythologies adds complexity to understanding the Nephilim. Many wonder whether this lack of mention truly shows that these female figures did not exist, or if somehow the ancient stories deliberately left out their presence for cultural or symbolic reasons. For some, the absence of direct accounts could simply reflect a story focus centered on the masculine, with giants described as men as part of a symbolic and mythological construction. However, for others, this absence points to something deeper and perhaps even suggests that giantesses were indeed not part of the equation. Beyond creating confusion, this issue also sparks curiosity among scripture readers, theology students, and people seeking to understand the mysteries contained within the Bible. Over the centuries, these questions about the Nephilim's nature and the possible existence of their female counterparts have fueled a wide range of interpretations, some more conservative, others more bold, but all aimed at offering a reasonable explanation of what truly happened during that distant period of human history. Given this subject's complexity, there are no definitive answers or information that can conclusively prove the existence or non-existence of giantesses. What exists are theories and ideas that, based on ancient stories and theological speculation, attempt to shed light on these mysterious beings. One of the approaches that has been frequently discussed regarding giantesses connects to the concept that the giants or Nephilim were hybrid beings, the result of unions between the Watchers, fallen angels, and human women. In this scenario, giantesses would theoretically be possible, but how could they be conceived? And what would their role or function be in the mythology and history of these massive beings? The debate continues, and to explore these issues more deeply, it is worth considering the various perspectives and interpretations that arise around the giantess figure. One of the most accepted ideas is that the giants, according to certain readings of biblical texts, were not merely human beings, but rather hybrid creatures, products of crossbreeding between different species, resulting in extraordinary height and physical characteristics. Within this perspective, the Nephilim would be considered beings of exceptional longevity, with lifespans far beyond those of common humans of the time, which ranged between 500 and 900 years. A perfect example of this is Methuselah, who is said to have lived to 969 years, and Noah, who reportedly reached 950 years, figures whose lives defied normal human limitations. Based on the longevity concept, scholars who support this idea argue that the giants were creatures of a more complex nature, with a biological makeup that would allow them to live for much longer periods. This would mean, according to this interpretation, that the Nephilim could live up to 3 times the life expectancy of common humans of the time. However, this longevity might come at a cost, with the creatures becoming progressively more sterile as time passed. For this reason, they would no longer be able to reproduce, resulting in no subsequent generation for these massive beings. Thus, the Nephilim would be considered hybrids incapable of reproduction. And when viewed as such, a line of reasoning emerges suggesting that being sterile, these giants could not create offspring since they would not have the ability to reproduce among themselves. In this scenario, the idea of giantesses would lose meaning, as reproduction among the male giants would be impossible, making female giants unnecessary for continuing the species or the Nephilim bloodline. This is where one of the greatest disagreements on the topic arises. If the giants were indeed hybrids and sterile, would the existence of giantesses be a biological impossibility or merely a narrative omission within the ancient stories? These questions continue to be debated in various academic circles, but there is still no agreement. The second perspective on ancient giants, which considers the possibility of giantesses, brings a different approach and challenges the idea that only male giants existed. According to this line of thought, it is possible that alongside the male giants, there were also women of similar height, and that these giantesses were female partners of these massive creatures. This argument is based on simple logic. If the giants truly existed with sizes ranging from 3 meters, approximately 9.9 feet, to 5 meters, about 16 feet, it would not be realistic for them to engage with women of average height like those described in ancient societies. The size difference between the giants and average women would make the union between these beings from a physical perspective a significant challenge, leading to the conclusion that the giants would need female partners of similar size for reproduction to be viable and natural. This theory is further supported when we consider women's role in society and in historical and biblical narratives. In biblical tradition, female figures were often not highlighted in family lines or in main narratives, something that can be explained by the patriarchal context dominant in ancient Middle Eastern cultures. According to this view, biblical genealogies focused primarily on men, or more precisely on male descendants, since they were the ones who carried the family name and inherited the lineages. In this context, women, although they played important roles in society, were often pushed aside, or when mentioned, their presence was treated as secondary. This emphasis on male figures was not limited to genealogies, but was also reflected in historical and mythological narratives, which frequently emphasized the deeds and accomplishments of men, while women, though essential, were relegated to the margins of great stories. Thus, when interpreting biblical passages that speak of giants, many scholars believe that the absence of references to giantesses could be attributed precisely to this patriarchal structure, which was also reflected in the scriptures. Therefore, the lack of explicit mention of the giants' female partners would not indicate that they did not exist, but rather a limitation of ancient narratives which prioritized male aspects. According to this view, the idea that giants had female partners can be seen not only as a biological and logical possibility, but also as a lack of attention to details that were considered secondary in a context where female figures rarely receive the same emphasis as men in genealogies and sacred stories. Furthermore, by considering that giantesses could have existed, this theory provides a more complete explanation of the process of generation and continuation of the Nephilim race, suggesting that the gigantic male creatures were not the result of an isolated union, but rather a reproductive system that involved both male and female figures, whose lineages were equally important, even if absent from the accounts. To support this theory, some scholars and enthusiasts of ancient history also highlight similarities with mythologies from other cultures, where giants and beings of great stature were often depicted accompanied by equally impressive female figures. In Greek mythology, for example, the giants known as Titans often had powerful partners and wives, and in Norse and other traditions, the presence of women with extraordinary characteristics was not uncommon. These cultural comparisons suggest that the existence of giantesses would not be an isolated idea, but rather an integral part of a global collective imagination that included both male and female figures in myths of extraordinary beings. The idea that giantesses were deliberately omitted from the scriptures and biblical narratives can therefore be seen as a consequence of the power structure and narrative focus of the time, which was centered on men and male lineages. In this scenario, women, including giantesses, would be viewed as secondary figures, not important enough to be recorded with the same level of detail as men. This view can also be interpreted as an attempt to preserve the patriarchal dominance of lineages, where descent and the family name were passed down from father to son, and female figures were largely relegated to the shadow of this structure. Ultimately, this theory offers an explanation for the absence of records about giantesses and reinforces the idea that although they were not explicitly mentioned, this does not mean their existence was denied or that they did not play an active role in the giants' history. For supporters of this view, giantesses would indeed be essential partners in the continuation of the Nephilim race, and their omission in the scriptures reflects more of a cultural and narrative choice than proof that they did not exist. A third perspective on ancient giants suggests that these beings were simply sterile, a concept that aligns with the first view discussed, but with additional details that deserve deeper analysis. According to this theory, giants, like other creatures of hybrid lineages, could have lived extraordinarily long lives, possibly up to 3 times the life expectancy of a common human of the time. As mentioned earlier, in several biblical eras, humans had impressive longevity, with figures like Methuselah, Noah, and Adam living beyond 900 years. From this perspective, the giants, descendants of fallen angels and human women, could have had even longer lifespans due to their hybrid nature and connection to heavenly entities. The main argument of this view is that with such long lives, giants would not necessarily need descendants to continue existing or to maintain their lineage. This could explain the absence of mentions of giantesses or female partners of the giants, as unlike common humans, these beings would not need to reproduce to survive for long periods or to ensure their existence after potential defeats or even death. In this context, the giants would be seen as immortal or exceptionally long-lived beings who, even without creating direct descendants, could continue to inhabit the world for thousands of years. Furthermore, it is important to note that giants appear again in the scriptures after the flood, which raises interesting questions about their origin and continuity. Several scholars interpret the reappearance of giants as a mysterious phenomenon, given that after the flood, the waters were supposed to have destroyed all of humanity except for Noah and his family. The most common theory among those who support this idea is that the fallen angels known as the Watchers returned to Earth after the flood to interact once again with human women, creating a new generation of giants. This possibility of a second race of Nephilim is supported by some interpretations of the scriptures, which suggest that despite divine punishment, the fallen angels continued their interactions with humanity after the flood event. However, even with this return, the giants gradually began to decline after the flood. Although many of them were still powerful and feared, their presence in the world became increasingly rare, especially as battles and wars against them intensified. A notable example of this can be found in Genesis 14, which tells of an ancient war between several kings and 3 races of giants. According to the biblical account, 5 kings united forces to face the giants and ended up defeating them. This event is significant because it illustrates not only the fall of the giants, but also their vulnerability before human opponents. This gradual decline of giants over time can also be observed in other biblical accounts, such as the famous story of David and Goliath, which, although one of the most well-known examples of a battle between a human and a giant, reflects a broader trend of giants being defeated in battles against human armies. The story of Goliath, one of the most symbolic about the presence of giants in the scriptures, is particularly interesting. Goliath, described as a giant more than 3 meters tall, represents the last great example of a giant warrior in confrontation with the Israelites. His defeat at the hands of David is not just a personal victory for the young shepherd, but symbolizes the final defeat of a race that, though powerful, was gradually being eliminated from history through successive confrontations. Goliath, as part of this giant lineage, is a clear example of the fall of a being who, although feared and revered in his time, was no longer unbeatable or untouchable. Although the presence of giants diminished over time, it is essential to highlight that in ancient cultures, many of these beings continued to be recognized as imposing figures, in some cases even revered as gods or divine descendants. The mythological narratives about giants, though they vary widely from culture to culture, often describe them as beings endowed with extraordinary abilities. These giants were capable of performing heroic or even divine feats, often seen as agents of destiny, playing central roles in stories that shaped civilizations. This reverence reflects not only the collective imagination about their immense grandeur, but also a perception of power that for societies of the time seemed beyond human comprehension. In many of these cultures, giants were not merely figures of fear, but also of profound respect. The interaction between humans and giants, when portrayed, was often filled with an atmosphere of reverent awe, as if these beings inhabited a realm beyond ordinary understanding. In Greek myths, for example, the Titanomachy, a series of battles between gods and titans, showcases the struggle of one divine generation against their giant predecessors, providing a clear example of the relationship between the human and the supernatural. In the biblical tradition, as in the passages describing the giants as the sons of God and daughters of men, this connection between humans and extraordinary beings is filled with ambiguity, a mixture of power, danger, and transcendence. However, over time, the presence of giants in historical narratives significantly diminished. Even so, their extinction did not occur suddenly, but gradually, reflecting the decline of an era where these beings seemed to dominate the collective imagination. The successive defeats of the giants and the weakening of the lineages that, according to some traditions, were composed of these imposing creatures mark the end of a cycle. This decline serves as a metaphor for the advancement of human civilizations, which over the centuries began to gain more ground, while the giants, once symbols of absolute power, were relegated to oblivion or transformed into mythological elements. This scenario of decline does not, however, mean that giants were invincible. Although the stories involving them, such as those described in the Bible, include notable victories like David's fight against Goliath, they also highlight the fragility and vulnerability of these creatures. Giants, no matter how powerful, were not unbeatable. In fact, many scholars interpret these confrontations not only as physical battles, but also as symbolic representations of the forces of good versus the forces of evil. The fall of the giants, as well as the rise of human heroes, reflects the triumph of human virtues, especially faith and courage, in the face of adversity. This historical cultural context opens the door to reflection on the different interpretations regarding the giants in antiquity and their interaction with women. Some legends speak of giants who at a certain point would have united with human women, creating hybrid descendants. However, the concept of giantesses or female giants remains a controversial and underexplored theme in ancient sources. Many texts, including biblical ones, focus almost exclusively on male giants, with little to no significant mention of female figures of that lineage. The absence of these female figures in the narratives may be seen as a cultural omission, reflecting the dominant patriarchy in ancient societies that often silenced the female presence, especially in epic and mythological tales. However, it is worth questioning. Does the absence of giantesses in ancient texts truly imply that they never existed? Or does this gap reflect more of a cultural bias than a historical reality? The truth is that without direct evidence, we cannot definitively claim that giantesses did not exist. To arrive at deeper conclusions about this topic, a more comprehensive study would be needed involving not just textual analysis of the scriptures, but also a reflection on the cultural, social, and historical influences that shape these narratives. The questions surrounding the existence of giantesses, as well as the possibility of a society of giants composed of both sexes, remain in debate among scholars, theologians, and enthusiasts of ancient cultures. Some suggest that the relationship between giants and humans may have been more complex than merely direct antagonism, and there could have been interactions between these beings and human societies, even leading to mixed lineages. Other theories point to the idea that giants could be hybrids, the result of the union between divine beings and humans, a proposal found in various mythologies and explored by scholars from different fields.